Hi students, this is Unit 1, Lesson 5, The Scientific Method in Psychology. In this lesson, we'll describe research methods psychological scientists use. Really, we're not going to get into that so much. We will talk about the reasons why we need the scientific method in psychology. So let's begin with research and the reasons that we need to lay out systematic systems for thinking critically when it comes to human behavior and mental processes. Remember that psychology, we're looking at behavior, we're looking at people's thinking, we're examining their thinking. And we need this because of things like hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is the tendency to believe after learning an outcome that one would have foreseen it. So when we look back on critical events, on big current events in maybe US history, we have this I knew it all along phenomenon known as hindsight bias. And so here's a couple examples where people might say, I knew that was going to come. So in 2001, there was a dot-com bubble which crashed and all these different businesses went kaput. So leading up to 2001, if we'd been paying attention to the economy, some economists might look back on that and said, yes, of course, the market was obviously overdue for a correction. Duh, you should have known it was coming. Or another example of hindsight bias is if we look at the 9/11 terrorist attack and the World Trade Center's North Tower was hit by a commercial airliner. And so some people will look at that and say, hey, you should have evacuated immediately. But that is definitely, the people in the South Tower should have evacuated immediately. But what we do when we look at those and kind of judge from our 20 years later seat is we discount the people who lived through those events and we don't put ourselves into their shoes. And so hindsight bias causes us to bring our own current judgments on past critical events. And it's really not fair. When we look at those terrorist attacks and somebody says the people in the second tower should have immediately evacuated after the first was hit. Well, we didn't know what was happening at the time. And so those people who, go back to work, some people did. And they paid with their life for that, unfortunately. But we cannot judge those people who did that because we weren't in that situation. Now, another reason why we have to supply the scientific method and think critically is because of overconfidence. And so I'm going to flash you some anagrams here where we reorganize the letters to make them make more sense, to make them make sense themselves. And see if you could predict how long would it have taken you if you had the letters on the left, how long would it have taken you to figure out, just a few seconds, 30 seconds, or what? Well, I'm going to give you another set of letters. See if you can turn this into a word. Now you can pause here if you don't want to move on to the answer, but typically it takes people 2 minutes, if at all, for them to figure out that this set of letters is actually the word chaos. Now, one of the reasons why it's harder for us to put that together is it's not a word that we hear a lot, and it's also got 2 vowels put together. So it's not really ones that we are exposed to a lot. So you may have overconfidently thought that you could put those letters into a word easily, but maybe you found out it took you a little bit longer than you really thought. So reasons to think critically, especially when it comes to human behavior and mental processes, is that people don't think like us. They don't act like us. And so we have to use the scientific method to critically analyze other people's behavior without bringing bias, without bringing our own judgments, and keeping an open mind when it comes to other people's behavior. Because after all, everybody's different, yet everybody's the same. So here are reasons why critical thinking is essential in the social sciences. When we use critical thinking, we are examining assumptions, which we should not have any assumptions until it's proven by research. Discerns hidden values, evaluates evidence, and assess conclusions. When we think critically, that's the things that we are doing in order to get ourselves to theories. Now, in psychology, we look at a lot of different theories which are assembled based on observation and evaluation and analysis. So scientists will amass loads and loads of data and distill it down into a theory. So if we have a theory such as low self-esteem contributes to depression, We observe people who perhaps have low self-esteem, and then have to figure out whether or not they are depressed. Now, this is a tricky kind of analysis, and we'll talk more about it, but using the scientific method to remind you about what the scientific method is and how a psychologist might use it. Number one, they're going to make an observation, and two, they're going to form a hypothesis. So the hypothesis might look like this. People with low self-esteem score higher on a depression scale. They're going to test that hypothesis by sending out surveys. Surveys might have questions like, or statements, maybe it's a Likert scale. It says, I have good ideas and I am fun to be with. And this will lead us to a depression diagnosis, perhaps. The fourth step here of the scientific method is where we collect those survey data and then analyze the results. If it fails, then we have to reform our hypothesis. If it passes, then we can draw conclusions. And the conclusions could be something like, yes, these things are connected. Self-esteem and depression are connected. We can make a prediction like, if we boost people's self-esteem, will their depression lift? So we want to focus on low self-esteem if this is our theory. One of the keys of the scientific method is that this has to be able to be replicated. And there's one of the places where this observation and hypothesis is going to get a little bit tricky. You also have to have the same survey data, like the same survey itself. If you're sending out a different survey, then it's all bogus. But if it passes many times, then it becomes a theory. We'll watch the Boys of the Big Bang Theory in class tomorrow. Remember that the goals of psychology are to describe, explain, predict, and control human behavior. And you'll see that these are similar goals in basic research. We want to be able to describe low self-esteem and depression, make predictions. We can improve depression by improving self-esteem, introduce enough controls over the variables. Then we would have to introduce an experiment rather than just a survey and explain the phenomenon with some degree of confidence. Hopefully the scientific method you recall from your earlier sciencey careers because you've had it many times before. So we have just described research methods. That is the scientific method in psychology, and we'll get into what sort of methods they use to apply the scientific research, scientific methods in psychology later in Unit 1.